Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
All right. This is Transportation Committee Chair Deb Barber. It is Monday, July 12th, 2021. Before I call the meeting to order, I'd like to say a few things about how we will conduct this meeting. Um, Currently, I want to acknowledge that COVID-19 is causing us to alter our usual procedures. As a result, we are conducting this meeting electronically. All votes will be taken by roll call. Before we start the meeting, we need to establish whether or not there's a quorum. With that, Becky, can you call the roll, please?
Chambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Ferguson. Fredson.
Here.
Gonzalez. Sterner. Zirin. Barber.
Here. Having a quorum present, I call to order the meeting of the July 12th, 2021 Transportation Committee. Our first order of business is approval of the agenda. Did anyone have any changes to the agenda? I would like to propose one change where we take the number 4 information item and move it to number 2 on our list of information items, if that's okay with everyone. All right, because we did change the agenda, I don't know that we have to have a motion or not. Becky, do you know?
Yeah, we should do a motion in a second
Okay,
and roll call.
then perfect.
Deb? If I could interrupt, Madam
Yep.
Chair, I think we also wanted to switch the order of Cole and Dave Burns's presentations following the Metro Transit one.
Okay, so it'll go 1, 4, 3, 2?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. If there isn't any other questions about that, I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda as amended.
It's Fredson, so moved.
Moved by Fredson, is there a second? Seconded by Chambliss, is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, Becky, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Ferguson. Fredson.
Aye.
Gonzalez. Sterner. Zirin. Barber.
Aye. With that, the agenda is approved. Next thing, we are on to approval of the minutes from the June 28th, 2021 meeting. Did anyone have changes or additions to the minutes? All right, seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Fredson, move approval.
It's moved by Fredson. Is there a second?
Cummings seconds.
Seconded by Cummings. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, Becky, would you call the roll, please?
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Ferguson. Fredson.
Aye.
Gonzalez. Sterner. Zirin. Barber.
Aye. With that, the minutes are approved. Next, we're on to reports, and the first is we have MTS, and we have Acting Director Amy Benowitz here to present.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. I just have a couple items today related to some recent press that we have been getting on some of our planning work, positive press. First, we had an article in the Star Tribune this past weekend and an interview both with Steve Peterson, who leads our highway planning group. The interview will air on WCCO tonight at 6 and again tomorrow morning. Both of them are regarding the $60 million federal infra grant the region received for the I-494 MnPass corridor project. We were a co-applicant with MnDOT on this $300+ million project, which will build a MnPass lane from Trunk Highway 169 to 35W in the cities of Edina and Bloomington, touching Richfield too. The 494 project will be built in 3 phases over several years and eventually will extend the MnPass lane all the way to the airport. This is one of the priorities for MnPass that was identified in our transportation policy plan a number of years ago. And so it's really starting to work us towards building out our MnPass system for the region. Secondly, we also continue to get attention on our work related to tracking travel trends. Ashley Asmus, our lead data scientist, participated in an interview with Fox 9 News that aired last week, I believe on Friday. Ashley provided them with a graphic that is on the council's website, which tracks the regional travel trends and currently shows that regional travel is getting close to being back to pre-pandemic levels overall. We're still down about 5 to 8%, depending on the location. But the data also shows that traffic is much more distributed throughout the afternoon peak. We don't have as strong of an afternoon peak, but it is starting earlier and extending longer into the evening. In addition, the morning peak continues to be significantly down below pre-pandemic levels. So we will continue to monitor these trends and update the graphic that is on our website and eventually determine what all of this means for our highway investment needs in the region. But in the meantime, it's really interesting and good information, and the press has really been paying attention to it over the whole COVID pandemic, really. So that is all I have to report today, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Amy. Are there questions from council members? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to Metro Transit General Manager Koistra.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I will keep it brief today, be recognizing the number of items, information items we have. So my report will be short. I just want to note very quickly that we continue to work hard to recruit operators to reach our ideal operator level. As part of the operating hiring efforts, we're holding another one-day event this week. This event will take place this Saturday, July 17th at 9 a.m. to noon at the Metro Transit Instruction Center. And I want to encourage all of you to share the information with any people, organizations you know who might be well positioned to help get out the word. And to help disseminate the word, we attached a flyer for Saturday's event to today's daily report and provided a flyer to Hannah Paulmeyer and Peter Grafstrom. So we're looking for all the help we can get. We need to hire operators. We had two events, as you know, previously that attracted about um, for which we were able to bring 40 applicants to the next step. And so we're going to continue to hold these one-day events in order to try to reach the operator levels that we need to reach. With that, I'm finished with my report.
Thank you, Wes. Are there questions from council members? All right, thank you. With that, we're on to our business for the day. So we have no items on consent. We have one item on non-consent. It's business item 2021-172, Southwest LRT SEH contract amendment number 3. And I believe we have Jim Alexander here to present.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jim Alexander, Project Director for the Southwest LRT project. So the item tonight is related to the SEH contract. That's Short Elliott Hendrickson. They're a consultant that's helping us with monitoring of contaminated materials as the civil contractor does their work out in the field. And we need this firm to essentially correctly identify contaminated materials that need to be hauled off site, either to direct sell or for daily cover. And so this is related to a business item that was brought before the council back in May 26th, business item number 2021-108, related to increase in contaminated soils or materials that we have on the project. And so we need to have a consultant continue the work to monitor this work as the civil contractor is doing their work. We have previously amended this contract in the past, and you see in the background where we originally started a little over $2 million for the contract, and in subsequent amendment, we added $853,000 to the contract to account for some delays that the the civil construction was experiencing, and just to account for the means and methods that were used by the civil contractor that were different from the assumptions made in the original contract. So, Madam Chair, I have a proposed action that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute Amendment Number 3 to contract 16P 298 with Short Elliott Hendrickson for construction monitoring of contaminated materials to add $3,116,522 for a total contract amount of $6,115,508. And I would also like to mention that we do track the DBE goal pretty closely here. The original contract was slated at 15%, and SEH is currently achieving just over 18% DBE. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Jim. Are there questions from council members? All right, seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2021-172.
Cummings moves approval.
It's moved by Cummings. Is there a second?
Fredson will second.
Seconded by Fredson. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none. Becky, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson, Fredson,
Aye.
Gonzalez, Sterner, Zirin, Barber.
Aye. With that, the motion carries. And that completes our actual business for the evening. I would recommend that item move on consent to the full council unless there's objections. All right. Then we're on to our information items. The first one is transportation equity working definition. We have Heidi Schalberg here, and she's going to introduce a couple of people from MnDOT who are joining us this evening.
Chair, I saw a hand up.
Oh, I apologize.
Madam Chair, this is Amy Venowitz again. I'm sorry, I goofed up when I changed that agenda order, and it's for the third and fourth ones that they should have stayed with Cole Hineker first and then Dave Burns with the before and after study last. So
Okay.
my apologies for that.
That's all right. That should be fine, I think.
Okay.
All right. So Heidi, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I will keep this really short. So I'm Heidi Schalberg, Transportation Planner in MTS, and I'm pleased to have two of our colleagues here today from MnDOT, who we regularly work closely with on transportation planning issues in general. And so they're here today to talk about their work on statewide multimodal transportation planning and specifically transportation equity. They presented to our Equity Advisory Committee at their meeting last month, and so we wanted to ensure that they had a chance to come and connect with this committee on the same topic tonight. So we have Abdullahi Abdullah, who is MnDOT's Transportation Equity Planning Coordinator. And we also have Hallie Turner, who is their Policy Planning Director. And so with that, I will just go ahead and turn it over to Abdullahi for the presentation.
Thanks, Heidi. Do you want us to share the presentation itself or you have it up? Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Heidi. As Heidi said, my name is Abdullahi Abdullah. And first of all, I'd like to start by thanking you, your time, Madam Chair, and members of the committee for having us tonight to talk to you about MnDOT's transportation equity and specifically the transportation equity definition. I'm joined by my colleague, Hallie Turner, who will be in the background and have some extensive understanding and knowledge about transportation equity initiatives at MnDOT and can answer some additional questions if they come up. A little bit about me. I started this role about 3 months ago. Let me actually start with my pronouns, which are he and him. And I started the role 3 months ago to lead our transportation equity planning work here in our central office at MnDOT. What I will talk, next slide, please. What I will talk to you tonight is specifically the definition, but I wanted to start with some little bit of context. So the Minnesota goal is where the work that we are trying to do to the transportation equity definition is housed in. The Minnesota goal vision, again, is the vision for transportation for the entire state. In this vision, we aim to deliver a multimodal transportation system that maximizes the health of people for the environment and our economy. Again, in other words, the vision answers some questions like, what are we trying to achieve? Next slide, please. So under the Minnesota Go vision is what we are actively working on right now. The Minnesota vision is 50-year vision. There's another plan which is directly underneath that, which is our own statewide multimodal transportation plan, or what we call SMTP for short. SMTP includes what we refer to as family of plans. That includes the Greater Minnesota Transit Investment Plan. It includes things like pedestrian and bicycle plans, a highway investment plan, and also freight, aviation, and rail plans, as well as ports and waterway plans. The statewide multimodal transportation plan, or SMTP, answers the question of how we are trying to achieve, or how are we trying to achieve the Minnesota Go vision, that 50-year vision for the state. This is for people that are walking and biking and rolling or taking to transit, or people that are using our airport systems or our waterways. Next slide, please. Now, this SMTP, or statewide multimodal transportation plan, translates that Go vision, the Minnesota Go vision, into general policy direction for MnDOT and also other transportation partners. The plan is for all users and all modes of transportation, and it's also applicable to anyone or any agency that has a role in our transportation systems. This plan, that is SMTP, is updated every 5 years. The last update was rolled out in 2017, and now we're actively working on the next update, which will be up or out early next year, or 2022. Next slide, please. Now, through our conversations with community members throughout the state, in 2017, so the last iteration of this update, we have heard a lot about community members for us to focus on these 6 areas that you see here. Those are aging infrastructure, climate change, economy and employment, transportation options, safety, and more appropriately for our conversation today, transportation equity. People wanted us to have more nuanced conversations and engagement and understanding about these topic areas. And each one of these topic areas or focus areas have a focus that are comprised of internal transportation experts as well as community members to advise on how to take some steps towards next steps in these focus areas. Next slide, please. But as we were having these conversations in the last couple of years, there was no consensus on how to define equity and what that means, whether that is, and how does showing up for everyone. Is it geographic equity? Is it something different? Is it modal equity, or is it about ability? So it wasn't defined. A little bit more about the work that we have done. Next slide, please. So the work that is where we started our Advancing Transportation Equity Initiative. This is a host of initiatives that MnDOT has been leading, and some of them are still actively going on since 2017 or 2018 timeframe. We started these initiatives, including multiple research projects. Some of those have been completed, others are still underway. We had completed a research project, for example, which we were calling Research Roadmap, under which we were working with the University of Minnesota. And this was specifically geared towards the state departments of transportation, where we could think about how to guide equity and incorporate equity into our transportation systems. We also looked into developing a set of performance measures as a research project by working with Texas Transportation Institute to review our existing performance measures and see how they can answer and hold us accountable when it comes to transportation equity. We are also in the process of kicking off another research project around gender equity, in which we are partnering with Metropolitan Council on travel behavior inventory as one of the data sources that we're using for that project. We have also started a series of community conversations to directly engage with community-based groups and organizations in rural and urban as well, throughout the state, really, to have better understanding of some of the challenges that are coming up for people, and how to come up with solutions to address those challenges. We have been taking some steps towards our own like internal programs and policies and process improvements to ask ourselves a series of questions about who our different systems and processes and policies are really helping, or who, what groups are they specifically harming. And we are also thinking about equity when it comes to updating our own plans. So right now we're doing our statewide multimodal transportation plan, and equity is at the center of our conversations. Performance measures is called out here. It's but I talked about it on the research project. So next slide, please. Now, these are some of the lessons that were learned, or some of the things that stood out or initially came up from our conversations. One of the biggest challenges was what we are here to talk about today, which is the definition of transportation equity. Because we didn't have a level understanding of, or a definition of transportation equity, it was very challenging for people to have a unified discussion about transportation equity and what that means. What is it? So people had no base level understanding or to start that conversation. So the work to define transportation equity is really grounded in the community engagement efforts and interests that have started in the last couple of years. Another thing that came out from our conversations with community members was the importance of acknowledging historic inequities, because more often when we are putting together our plans and programs, we are more forward-looking and thinking about the future of transportation, not necessarily pausing and thinking about the past and the historic harms that transportation caused to some specific communities or some communities. Another thing that came out, or one of the lessons learned, is that sometimes we might focus on specific areas or neighborhoods when we're thinking about transportation solutions, but it's also important to address some of the broader transportation challenges that are coming out and have applicability throughout the state. Another thing that came out from one of the things that we learned from these conversations is that, yes, even though it's important to do research and have level setting, understand where we are on transportation equity, it's not enough, and that we need to do more than that and come up with solutions. Next slide, please. So now, a little bit more context to our transportation equity before I reveal our definition in the next slide is that I would like to use, I'm using this graphic, which is a bit simplistic and sometimes can confuse people, as there's one mode of transportation that is used here, which is a bicycle. And the idea here is not to show preference for bicycles. Nothing against bicycles, I like biking, but this is to indicate that transportation equity is not really the same as equal distribution of resources. In this example, you see 3 people that you visibly have different needs, but at the same time, they were given the same bicycle, which is equal distribution of resources. So this is equality, it's not equity. Transportation equity is rather trying to understand people's needs by letting them their own stories, so that you understand what type of bicycle this person needs, what type of bicycle or vehicle or other transportation mode that will meet their needs. It's about understanding specific transportation issues that people are facing by hearing from them. It's also about being specific about what problems we are trying to address. So it's a little bit getting into more contextual understanding of people's unique circumstances and needs. Transportation equity is also about humanizing the transportation industry and thinking about people and centering people in our discussions and conversations, which is very difficult. In transportation talk, we often get into the weeds about data and vehicle level of services and asset conditions. Yes, those are very important metrics and elements that we have to consider, but people are really what transportation equity is about. Transportation equity is also about naming various transportation harms and inequities that have happened in the past, as we talked about it was one of the lessons learned, that the importance of naming and acknowledging harm. And that is still essential because we cannot just look forward and think about future solutions if we don't pause and think about the past and reassess and think about how we came to where we are today. And most importantly, though, to just reemphasize this, transportation equity is about centering people in our transportation conversation, especially people that have endured so much harm. I'm saying this because in the definition that we will share, it will be apparent there are some specific historically excluded groups that would be called out. And that is the intention was just to make sure that this is reflective of past harms, but also looking forward at the same time. So now the next slide, we will reveal what our current draft transportation equity definition looks like. This is still in draft format. Any feedback is very helpful and necessary, and we really appreciate that. And Hallie put that also in the chat, so thank you, Hallie. I will be quiet for a second here and let you read that, and then I will talk about how this came about and what my ask is today of you all. So hopefully people read through this. This is how we're defining transportation equity. It's not final, as I said. I will just repeat this multiple times. This is still draft. So anything that you pick out, anything that you think should not be here is very helpful and necessary, and we will take that back to a group that helped us draft this. So this is how this came about, is that we worked with one of the 6 focus areas that area work groups that I talked about, the equity work group, and a small team of volunteers that helped us craft this definition, and they proposed this definition for us. What we're doing right now is vetting this through the process, connecting with people from MnDOT and MBOs like Met Council, as well as other transportation insiders, as well as community-based organizations and individual community members, to make sure this transportation resonates with people, to make sure this transportation is reflective of how they experience transportation. And in the next month, the next couple of months after starting August up until end of the year, we will be vetting this through the process. It's starting with the equity work group, who will take everything that we have heard so far and then refine this transportation equity definition so it looks a little bit different and reflective of everything that we have heard so far. So my ask of you today is to share your perspectives, your thoughts, things that stood out to you as you saw this definition. And then if you have any recommendations of people, either organizations or individuals that you would like us to connect with, we'll do so. So those are my asks. I have some additional slides, but they are all about those next steps and also some process next steps. I will just pause here and hear any initial questions or comments.
Thank you, Abdullahi. Any questions from council members or comments? I'm not seeing any hands up yet, but I would love to hear what our EAC, what their feedback was to you.
I think I have to take that one, Abdullahi, because I was there. And
Go ahead. Yes.
I was in deep listening mode. So I'm going to pull up my notes so that I make sure that I don't mischaracterize anything that people said. And I will invite Heidi to step in and clarify if I missed or have misspoken at all. A lot of notes. Abdullahi even this week was like, how did you type so much when you were presenting the information? And I wanted to hear it all. So pretty consistently across the board, but also definitely at the equity, the EAC, we were hearing that things like fair feels like is out of place, because when people hear fair, they hear equal. And whether or not that's actually the case, that's how people interpret it. So when we're putting out a definition about equity, that should cause us some pause to see if we're using the right word. We also had people say that they were getting stuck on kind of the acknowledgement of burdens. Like, how do we conceive, obviously in this definition, it does say BIPOC, but what does like a burden actually mean? And we don't always do a great job in transportation describing that. There was a conversation about how services stand out. We talk a lot about things like the transportation system as a whole, or if we're doing projects, we do environmental justice analysis, but we don't always talk about like how we actually serve our communities once our transportation system is built. So services was an important acknowledgement that people don't always see in conversations around transportation equity. There was support for acknowledging the historic harms, which Abdullahi had shared as a lesson that MnDOT has been taking in as well. There were conversations on how can we make sure that we can continue to acknowledge these injustices, but also acknowledge that we are kind of on notice to proceed differently in the future in order to mitigate them. And while this definition highlights decision making, for example, that's not the only means by which we have to mitigate. There was a lot to unpack in the EAC. Heidi, is there anything that you would add that I missed that's coming to mind for you?
No, I think that was a great summary, Hallie.
Great, and thank you for that. I appreciate that. Anything else from other council members? I will just a quick.
This is
Oh,
Councilmember
go ahead,
Chambliss.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Oh, that's okay. So I agree with the feedback regarding the transportation equity working definition. Transportation equity ensures the benefits and burdens. I might replace the word burden with ensure the benefits and investments of transportation spending, services, and systems. And then the word fair, I would maybe make that more specific to the goal that you're trying to achieve. So maybe think about that when you talk about rewording it. Fair is often subjective and difficult to measure. So if you could think about a word that equates to the outcome in getting to equity, that might be more helpful. Or just take that our fair part out completely, because equity is what the focus is. That's just my 2 cents.
I think those are good comments because fair can be very subjective to whoever's interpreting fair. At least, yeah, that's the way I see it, I think. So, all right, any other questions or comments from council members? If I run through one of your further slides, just a little bit of information for the committee members. The engagement will go throughout the summer, and Equity Regroup will refine the definition based off of all of this input. So please, if you have additional input as you reflect this, get it to Abdullahi and Hallie. They would appreciate it. It'll go to the Policy Advisory Committee in October, and then through final review in October and November, and will be included in the draft SMTP in early 2022. So there is some time, but definitely please reflect on this and send any comments along to our partners at MnDOT. All right, anything else? Anyone? Abdullahi or Hallie, do you need anything from us beyond that?
No, that's great. Thanks, Madam Chair, for summarizing some of the next steps on how to get connected with us and get feedback to us. That is all we're asking for. Please, if you, as you reflect on this, especially if this is the first time that you have seen this, we do understand this. It will take a minute until you can think about the whole thing and what you would like to change or what suggestions you have. So please connect with us. Our emails are, I think, the last slide. So reach out to us and let us know if you have any additional thoughts. This is the last couple of slides just have some additional engagement efforts that are undergoing that MnDOT is doing to just connect with the public throughout about the statewide multimodal transportation plan. But these are our emails, so please feel free to reach out or suggest some other community members that you would like us to come and talk to and have either one-on-one conversations or group conversations with people. So again, thank you so much for having us tonight.
Madam
Absolutely.
Chair.
Go ahead, Amy.
Thanks. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I did want to interject and say if council members have comments or are sending comments, if they could copy me on those. And what Heidi and I will do is compile the comments in total, and and then come back to either you or the committee and see if we should send a council letter. If we have widespread agreement among council members, we can have that conversation whether the council as a whole wants to send a comment letter on to MnDOT.
Thank you, Amy. That's a good point. And I think Heidi serves on the equity work group, so she's well connected with all of this work. And so it's a good opportunity to kind of centralize things through her and Amy.
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, if there's no other questions or comments from council members, thank you, Abdullahi and Hallie. Appreciate you coming today. So we'll try and get you some feedback.
Thanks. Have a great night.
You too. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're on to what our next information item is the Emerging from the Pandemic, a Stronger and Better Transit System, Part 1. And we have Wes Koistra, Eric Lynn, Adam Harrington, and Brian Funk. I'm not sure which one of you is kicking off. I'm going to start.
Madam Chair, this is Wes, and I'll start us off. I'll just say as a matter of introduction that today is the first part of a two-part information item series outlining how Metro Transit is working to emerge from the pandemic, a stronger and better transit system. For the last year, we've been engaging in future planning at Metro Transit among its leadership and staff. And our goals is to not simply return to the pre-pandemic as usual, but rather to use this as an opportunity to seek ways to improve the way that we serve customers and the region. This includes being deliberate and intentional and embedding equity and sustainability into our decision making. And today, the part one presentation will focus on the data we are watching, our August quarterly service changes, and the operating hiring update. At the July 26th meeting, we'll talk more about how we are using this data and other information and taking advantage of new opportunities to develop a broad-based approach to emerging from the pandemic, to rebuilding ridership, and to strengthening our transit system. So this is coming to you in two parts. This is the introduction, and with that, I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Eric Lynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Wes. Thanks for having me here. So you can move on to the next one, please. Tonight, as Wes mentioned, we're sort of laying the groundwork for our stronger and better plans, which we'll be presenting over the next two sessions. So there's three pieces to the presentation tonight. The first one is talking a little bit about transit fundamentals and things that we think we know that are still true even during COVID and as the period after COVID, whatever that becomes known as. The second bit is going to be the bulk of the presentation, which is what are the data that we've been watching during the pandemic? What are the things we're watching for changes going forward? And then, of course, what are the implications of those? And as we move into the third part, we'll talk about near-term service changes that are happening and how this data is informing our medium-term planning as well with the whole stronger and better effort. Next. Okay, so starting with what we know, and really this is just a two-slide crash course in transit planning. Next slide, please. And the reason that we wanted to start with this is just to remind everyone that there are certain things that are true structurally about how transit works and where it works and when it works that are still true during COVID. They're still true after COVID. They're true because it has to do with the layout of communities and how efficient it is to bring people to and from on those corridors using shared vehicles like transit vehicles. So there's always a dance in transit between supply and demand. We know that the transit supply that we put out there is most effective and most efficient when it is direct, when it is frequent, when the time of day that the service is running matches the time of day that someone or people want to travel, and when the travel time is competitive. And so all of these, of course, feed back on each other. You know, if you have a direct line between two places on a corridor, that's certainly going to be a competitive travel time versus kind of a wandering, meandering route. You know, if you have a frequent service, you're going to be more likely to match when someone is ready to depart on their particular trip. And so all these things are kind of positive feedbacks on each other. So we know how to provide this service, which will meet the demands of people that travel. The trick with transit is that we cannot do this everywhere for every trip. Okay, so the resources at some level, which we'll get to at the end of this presentation, constrain our ability to provide direct, frequent, all-day competitive travel time service. And so in looking at where and when we can provide service, we have to try to match that service to the demand that we think will be there. And as we provide the service and see the demand, we have to adjust based on that. Next slide, please. There's a lot of guidance that we have from regional policy. So the Transportation Policy Plan, Appendix G, the document goes into great detail about where, when, how much, what type, spacing between routes, spacing between stops, lots of details that guide this investment based on the demand profile that is likely present in different communities. And the map on the right is a refresher of the transit market areas, which are defined based on population and job concentrations, walkability and car ownership, the sorts of things that you would think predict transit being very successful. And just as a reminder, as you go from the dark blue urban centers out to the lighter blue to the green, you're kind of stepping down in order of magnitude of transit supply and demand. Okay, so next slide, please. So with those fundamentals in mind, lots has changed, obviously, and we've been before this committee talking about ridership changes before, and so some of this might be repetitive, but it's still good to look at it with maybe a fresh lens. So I'm going to go through a few of the things we're watching during COVID, and then also what we're watching to indicate how things are changing now that we might be coming out of a full COVID environment. So next slide, please. So the first slide is one I know you've seen before, but to refresh your memory, this is a time series really telling the story of what's happened to ridership on Metro Transit since March 2020, which is the zero line, if you will, kind of at the top left there. And of course, there have been big changes, big losses in ridership, but for today's conversation, what I want to focus on are two things. One is the difference between types of transit here. And so if you look at the blue colored dots, the green colored dots, the red colored dots, moving from top to bottom, so that's the local bus network, the light rail system, and then a commuter express bus and commuter rail and North Star. And you see that they all have sort of different levels that they settled out at during COVID. And the local bus, including the arterial BRT network, was much more robust to COVID in terms of ridership loss than was the light rail. And both of those were much more robust than the commuter express patterns. Now, of course, this to me simply reflects the proportion of the trip making happening on these modes that is connected to one particular trip that isn't happening much anymore. And of course, that's the work to office commute. Okay, so the office 9 to 5 commute is a trip that essentially disappeared from the landscape and is barely recovering as we move forward. And so to the extent that each of these types of service served that trip purpose, they've been impacted sort of different relative scales. So the first thing is the difference in levels. The second thing is even though there are some kind of ups and downs, some little wiggles, if you will, as you go across through time, the remarkable thing about these levels is that they've been really stable. There haven't been big jumps and dips as things have changed over the last 15 months. There's kind of been a consistency to the ridership on these different modes. that I think reflects the fact that the travel behavior underlying this hasn't changed very much either. So we've had a lot of stability in terms of who is using transit and for what purposes. We don't have a lot of great detail on those individual purposes, but we can infer some things, especially from what we'll talk about next. But the thing about travel behavior, you'll often hear it described as being sticky. This is especially true for things like work commutes, where you get into patterns based on a weekday or whatever your 9 to 5 schedule might be. And that repetition kind of reinforces itself over time and can become difficult to change. And what we saw with COVID was there was a massive forced change in people's travel behavior, to say the least. And the question that we have before us in trying to figure out transit demand and supply is how sticky were those changes? And as the constraints that COVID put on us are released, how much is that going to change back? So next, please. So one of the biggest changes that, and thank you, Amy, for bringing up the news report that featured this data from our colleagues at MTS, because it drives exactly with this, which is whereas we had these very sharp peaks prior to COVID, which is represented in the dash line here, sort of the boardings that are happening by hour of day, there was a very symmetrical AM and PM peak. This is the same thing on the transit system and the roadway, and of course they're related. But we used to have this very distinct two-hump shape. And in fact, during COVID and since, what we've had instead is a single peak. We've had a building of trips throughout the day towards a late afternoon peak, and then somewhat of a normal decline into the evening hours. And what this reflects is, rather than having a dominance of, again, that single trip purpose of 9 to 5 office commuting, you have an accumulation of lots of different trip purposes throughout the day. So if you're going out to run errands at 11 o'clock, there might be 2 of your neighbors doing the same thing. If you do an errand at 3, there might be 8 of your neighbors doing the same thing. That's the general idea, is that there's this kind of accumulation of lots of different, not coordinated trip making. And it's what you see if you are out on a Saturday and you run an errand that at 8 in the morning there's no traffic, but at 4 you might run into a slowdown. That's just simply lots of people traveling for different purposes. So this is an important dynamic because it changes the shape of our service, which of course has been oriented towards these peaks as well. Next slide. So in addition to sort of the time series and the changes in time of day, we have to think about where things are changing on the map. And so I want to highlight a couple of things we think we've learned about the geographic component of ridership during COVID. And these 2 maps are just kind of trying to illustrate, before you squint too hard at them, that we are looking at these maps in pretty fine detail, generally at the census block group level. So it's pretty finely disaggregated, looking at where transit demand is located right now. Next slide. The two of the factors that we've found to be really important are, on the left, the percent of housing units in a census block that are occupied by renters. So versus the occupants being homeowners, occupants are renters. And on the right, the median household income by block group. And so both of these, the more yellow color represents areas that are likely to be more high propensity transit ridership areas. And so if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is sort of a chart of where we looked at all of these in combination. If you click forward one, it'll highlight those 2 factors as being some of the biggest ones that we found. When we looked at controlling for the amount of service that was out there, this is really asking, where is their demand propensity? And what can we say about the areas that have high demand propensity even during COVID? And really our conclusions reflect economic need. And so people that are renting and people that are of lower income are certainly the ones who are using transit at a much higher rate than those that are homeowners or that have higher income. Next slide, please. Oh, and you can go one more. So that kind of summarizes, what we've seen about who is still using transit. I think one of the biggest questions, of course, is what about people who are not using transit? We've been trying to engage with that group as well, of course, and one of the things that our colleagues did in marketing last fall was to take a sample of people who were regular riders on the system that had given us their contact information through the go-to card system. So we kind of knew they were regular riders, and we asked them, you haven't been on board, since COVID. When you think about coming back to Metro Transit, what is it that motivates you to think about, yeah, I think that would be a good reason to return? And what we found is that the most common answer was that people wanted to avoid traffic and parking hassles. And can you click forward one? It should underline a bit. I want to do one more. Sorry, the text in the top is a little bit small to read, but it says among those with their own or shared access to a vehicle, that reason is even more prevalent at 53%. Essentially, we know that traffic and parking are motivators for people to use transit, especially those that have vehicle access. It's one of the things that people love about Metro Transit is it allows them to not worry about the daily grind of getting to and from where they need to go. And most often, of course, we're thinking about a 9 to 5 office commute there, but it's certainly not the only trip purpose that they have. So thinking about traffic and parking, we have to immediately start thinking about telecommuting and the role of telecommuting now in reducing the number of people who are simultaneously traveling to office parks, to downtown areas, to job centers. And that reduction, and of course it's an open question what the long-term reduction is going to be, but that reduction is going to in turn impact traffic and parking hassles. It may or may not change the price of parking, but it may make parking more available. Traffic may not be what it was. We're still not sure, but as Amy was hinting at, when we look at the general trends, we don't see the same sharp concentration of traffic happening in the peaks, and so that might be lessening the motivators for people to use transit. And that's the bottom line here, is that if people say their main motivations are traffic and parking, and we see a lot less traffic and parking hassles, the conclusion has to be that the transit use is going to lag those problems. So that's kind of the approach we're taking in thinking about using data for planning. Can you go to the next slide, please? And we're going to look at these trends. We're looking at traffic and we're looking at parking. So we have the advantage of partnering with MnDOT through their extensive sensor network that are in the roadways around the cities. And here we're highlighting that we can pull out actually entrance ramps to the highway and exit ramps from the highway to downtown Minneapolis on all sides. And we can look at the trends in those particular on and off ramps to see where there might be increases in traffic recently. And so these are data through last week. And each point here represents a particular day for the inbound on the left and the outbound on the right. What you can see is two things we've been talking about. One, the AM side on the left is lower than the outbound side on the right, the PM side on the right. And also there's differences among corridors, and I-94 seems to be experiencing a lot more traffic in and around downtown than some of the other corridors, especially the 35W south side. Next slide. So we're also looking at parking. So these data come to us from the city of Minneapolis. We want to thank them for their partnership as well, but they're able to look at for each day in a given parking facility that they control. Each dot here is the max percent utilization for that day. So whatever the peak demand for a parking was in those city ramps on a given day, that's what the dot represents. And then the trend is shown by that blue line. So what you can see is it looks a lot like commuter express ridership. There was a giant crash in March 2020, and there hasn't been a really strong or sustained recovery. The exceptions are interesting to look at. One exception in the top right of the panel there is the federal courthouse. You can see the big bump that happened in spring of this year during the Chauvin trial. After that, it's gone back to declining. But maybe more interesting, Ramp C and Riverfront there on the bottom row, both have a little bit more sustained increases over the past few months. And it's interesting because those reflect more all-purpose trips. So those are not connected so much to office facilities as they are, for instance, the North Loop area for Ramp C. it's short-term parking, it's not contract parking. So what you're seeing there is a return of kind of all-purpose travel to downtown Minneapolis, much more so than a 9 to 5 commute. And of course, if you get out your calendar and align the dates, you'll also see the demand from the Twins games really elevating ramp A and ramp B too. So next slide. Okay, the last data series that we're watching with sharp eyes, and we'll hear more about in a minute, are the number of cut trip alerts that we've been sending out. So we have a great new transit information system where we can broadcast alerts in real time about trips that have to be cut due to, issues with a disabled bus or not having the operators to run the service. And it's something that obviously it's the first thing we try to avoid, but when it does happen, we like to be able to notify people of it. So we can actually look through time at how this is changing. And for most of COVID, we did not experience very many issues with meeting the schedule that we had promised. And recently, we've started to encounter a little bit higher spikes in days where we have to send out notices of late service or cut service. And really, this comes back to what Brian Funk will talk about in a minute, which is the number of operators that we have limits our ability to provide the service. And we can, it goes back to the very first slide about we can't serve every trip everywhere. What trips can we serve? Well, first we have to know how many operators we have before we start to do that allocation. So I'll quickly go through a few implications. Next slide, please, of these trends. Next. Okay, so from the ridership trend, the takeaway should be, I think we should expect slow change in ridership. I don't think we should expect a spring back to that zero line, if you will, looking at that line. I think it's going to be a slow growth, and it's going to depend on how sticky these behaviors are for people. And the best that we can do now, I think, in transit is provide the supply we think will do well and measure the demand as people try to use it. And these ridership numbers are an aggregation of millions of different decisions by thousands and tens of thousands of people. So in some cases, the best thing we can do is provide the service and get people to consider it. So we do have some potential perturbations that might do something like shift the behavior back to what it was before. If you do see a massive increase in congestion from whatever reason, just people coming back to work, from other issues, whether it's construction or something else, those are often good motivators for people to get back on board transit. If we do have any economic impacts, like a gas price spike for whatever reason, that again, adding to the cost of driving can make people think positively about using transit. Or if there are policy interventions, to make driving and parking more expensive. Those are things that, if transit is to succeed, might be something that is necessary to think about, but that's of course pretty far above my pay grade. Next. So for thinking about the time of day, we're talking about trying to match the pattern here, which is all day, all purpose travel. It's not easy to predict exactly how people are going to use the network, which means you have to make it useful for everything. And that if we design our service specifically around single purpose trip making, like 9 to 5 office commutes, it's really fragile. And this is a very old story in lots of different fields, but from thinking about nature and thinking about financial investments, diversity is strength, right? So lots of different options means you're going to have robustness to disruption. And the more that you're tied to a single thing, the more fragile you are. And in the meantime, what we can do, in addition to getting that all-purpose travel supported with our network, is to improve the performance of that as we look at speed and reliability, and partner with our local agencies, counties, and cities to help make that transit run really well. Next. Okay, then the last implication I want to describe before turning it over to Adam is to talk about the map. We know if we want to have pure ridership return on service, we have a pretty good idea of where we should put that service. Even during COVID, while the rate of return on investment may not be as high as it used to be, the relative areas on the map, well, we know where those are. The flip side of that is if we are running service to areas that are more low propensity for whatever reason, then we shouldn't necessarily hold those to the same standard in terms of being as productive, but it doesn't eliminate the need or the reason for serving those areas. There are lots of different reasons besides pure ridership return to be putting transit service out there. The other thing about the map concentrations, which we haven't dwelled on today at all, is that in some cases, the highest propensity for ridership really does align with our equity mission, both in terms of economic opportunity, but also, historic disinvestment in communities of color tend to also show up on the map as places where there's higher propensity for ride. So to the extent that we can both serve current day transportation needs and also be more aligned with our equity mission, I think there are opportunities here. Next. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam Harrington to talk about how these data are going to inform our near-term service changes.
Great, thanks, Eric. All of the data that Eric provided today is really a good backdrop for how we've been planning our service and what it looks like today and our steps forward. Next slide. So this will be a familiar couple of images for you, but just to refresh, the image on the left of the screen, which is the map of the region, represents where our service concentrations are today. And since March of 2020, we've made several adjustments to our service network throughout that past 15 months, but we've always focused on those core service areas, and that remains true today. And as illustrated by the chart on the right, we're basically providing 90 to 100% of our pre-pandemic service levels on our local service and 25 to 30% on commuter express. So we continue to be focused on those all-day trips and finding ways to strengthen them both in our service delivery, but also in other ways, whether it be capital investments or bus stops. Next slide. Here's a map of the August 21st service changes. These are routes that will be having frequency improvements or are restored service. So we have 14 commuter express routes that we are returning to service or adding service to. So this isn't the complete picture of all the service necessarily, but it just is highlighting those areas that we're improving on August 21st. Our goal for the express network for commuters into the downtowns was really to provide a core route in each one of the corridors into the downtowns and something that we can build upon. These corridors all have strong park and ride locations, and we'll be anchoring off of them. And as Eric alluded to, we'll be monitoring the ridership and working continuously with our downtown partners to understand when people might be coming back more and more and how we can adjust our services to help do that. The other couple routes in here I'll point out are Route 3. There's a black line in the middle, and there'll be frequency improvements to that. We'll actually be adding to the high frequency network between Snelling Avenue and the North Loop in downtown Minneapolis. So we'll be extending that service and improving our bus stops along that corridor as well. Also, the Route 4 will be making some adjustments to this route between Silver Lake Village and New Brighton and Mounds View, looking at extending some local service to provide better job access and making a connection at Silver Lake Village. So this gives an overview of where we're adding service for August 21st. And you may have noticed we've been trying to get the word out a little bit earlier than we normally do. We know that our customers are trying to plan their lives for this fall, primarily, is what we've been hearing. And so trying to get that word out on where those improvements will be. Next slide. So this is a summary of those improvements I mentioned. The other thing I'll point out is as we watch and listen to our partners and businesses in making these adjustments, we'll also be starting the 10-minute frequency on LRT a little bit earlier in the morning than it is today, and that will accommodate both rush hour traffic into the downtowns, but one of the large impetus for this is the University of Minnesota will be back in session, and we want to make sure that we provide good capacity for those routes. So when we've made these changes, we will still have 40 routes that will remain suspended. These are largely commuter express routes. And what we're hoping to do as we watch these trends is have the ability to add trips to those routes that we're returning to service that are really the anchors for each of these commuter express corridors on the freeways, and bringing that back as we have operators available. So this is a snapshot of what we're doing for August, but we also have a number of changes planned for December, some of which you've heard a little bit about earlier, but we'll be coming back in a couple weeks to talk more about those. But when we think about bringing back service, one of the important things is balancing the service that we deliver with the reliability of expecting it to be operated. So there's a juxtaposition between the lost trips slide that Eric showed and how much service we bring back and how many operators we have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Funk to talk about our bus operator resources. Next slide.
All right, thanks, Adam and Eric for the overview and lead in, and for council on the line, Brian Funk, acting chief. I'm gonna just sort of give you highlights of where we're at today, what we're, and I have a special introduction to wrap up my portion of the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so as Adam and Eric, there's not really a sense in the street if we're not going to be able to reliably operate that. Because we're users of the system, that when we put service out, it needs to be there every single day without fail. There's lots of reasons why a bus may not be a scheduled trip, but as an agency, we take it, need to make sure that reliability is a cornerstone of what we're doing. Promise is fulfilled to the highest degree possible.
I think, Brian, your audio is cutting out a little bit.
Next slide. All right, thanks. I'll speak up here. And so one of the key measures that we have here at Metro, be able to tell you how we're doing resources, is to look at the number of employees full-time and also part-time weekday. Right now, during our current service schedule, is 1,186 and our actual 1,163. Not exactly where we want to be. However, as I'll show you, it's a better position than we have been years. And so moving into August, we're going to see a increase. Adam's team did a masterful job of being able to both add service, but also redistribute then our labor agreement to add that service, have a huge increase in the number of operator resources that are going to need to be deployed on the street. And so our number actually bumped up slightly for our number of students in training, which additional folks start today. We have applicants who are in that later stage of the hiring. And we have a goal of 12 for each of our bi-weekly. I'll show you why that is here on the next slide, please. So this chart showing you over the last 3 years our operator staffing, which currently is that 1186 versus our actual. And so Alf and others have briefed you before, but you can see that several years we've been understaffed, and start March, the scheduled March 2020 pick, for about 120 operators below our ideal level. Big spikes with a lot of service customers experienced, illustrated by Eric earlier in the day. The bottom fell out, as we all remember. So that we needed to provide every day in down to just over 1,000 of those operators, and our staffing stayed about the same. And so while our operators continued to work with us and for us, we had to thing, and we slowed down hiring while attrition with demand. And so we monitored that very closely through And as we saw those lines start to come a little bit closer to, we jump started the process again over the winter with our advertising starting in about February before and now we're just, but we think we're going to have some things in place come back. So next slide. All right, and finally, here's what we're doing about it phase. And so we have refreshed on our team, our marketing efforts, and we're hitting, the tried and true social media, working through and putting articles to flyers to job organizations and working through our connections. We're also working on giving business operators with QR codes so that they're able to be those ambassadors and cash in on some of the referral bonus available. We're working on paid social media through our partners like Move Minnesota, Pop-Up, and then really what we've found is that there's a couple of help us identify and drive quality potential employees to our doorstep through employer referrals. And so working really hard, leverage the talent that we have in-house within the communities that we're serving. Employees are able to acquire a referral bonus. Anything else, they're able to bring in high quality, good people. $1,000 hiring bonus. Now it should be no. Our industry, like many industries, is in right now. We're competing for a limited workforce. We have seen driving careers continue to be one of the specialties that are out there. We need quality. It does not make any sense for Metro Transit bring in anybody. This isn't a job that just anybody can. We have a lot of things going for us. We have a apprenticeship program for people when they do tour and are able to have a connection. And but the most important thing is to be able to get that interest. So through a streamlined hiring process, we're going to, as the general manager mentioned at the outset, event this coming Saturday at our training center on North 7th. So those are just a few of the highlights. And then finally, I want to introduce you. Amina. Amina is her regular full-time manager at the MJR garage. Amina's been an employee about 14 years, and she's now a deputy director in the bus transportation area, taking on a great responsibility, high-profile position here for the operations side of the house to really evaluate, do a thorough review of doing the last several years, what we need to be doing moving forward with human resources, marketing, and then our internal to ensure that when we do attract we're able to get them started and off. So happy to have Amina taking a lead role in this. And with that, unless you wanted to add anything, I think any of us could stand for questions.
Very good. Thank you all, and congratulations, Amina. Glad to have you in this role. Any questions or comments from council members? Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you, and congratulations to Amina also. This probably is a question for Eric, right? But on slide 12, one of the questions we asked folks were important reasons to return to transit. I'm just wondering if we asked the question in terms of, why haven't you returned to transit? We've heard a lot about safety. Obviously, we share concerns about safety, and I'm just wondering if we asked that question. The second, or if we felt like it was a false premise. The second is, and I think it's smart to make adjustments here, just based on sort of our return to so-called normal. Also would, I'm interested to know what folks' thoughts are as it relates to, before we were to make any kind of drastic changes. I think there just needs to be a longer period of time to really see what kind of impacts COVID has had on long-term ridership. And this was referenced, right? But, specifically the return to work sort of starting at Labor Day, I think for a lot of both private sector business is also government. You know, I know most folks I know at the city of St. Paul still are working from home, and I think you'd see sort of spikes connected to folks working in government and post Labor Day. So just kind of interested to know what timeline you think we would need to assess prior to making any kind of more significant adjustments.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Fredson, I'll start just by saying we did ask people about their perspectives on safety. The survey that was run was in fall 2020. So a lot of the questions about why haven't you come back were more around, are you actually traveling anywhere, or are you still teleworking 100% of the time, and so forth. We did ask people about their perspectives on safety, and of course there were people that give us dimensions of COVID safety and people that give us dimensions of personal safety and security. Both those are important to people. I think when our agency is definitely focused on making sure that it's a safe trip in every dimension. That's one of the things we're offering. But I think what the focus of my, I guess, data dive, if you will, is more the structural pieces of the travel behavior and whether people are even open to the decision before they get to, well, wait, I have to think about safety. It's sort of like, is there a trip that matches their need, if that makes sense. And to that extent, thinking about post Labor Day, we know we're going to get a bump in college associated travel as University of Minnesota and other places are back in session. We know that our high school service is going to be running again. We know there's going to be certainly lots of people that are changing their travel patterns and getting unstuck from what we've been doing the last 15 months. And that is an opportunity for us to make those trips kind of get sticky on our system, and we want to do that. I think though that you're right, it's going to be more of a slow climb than a spring back, if I can put it that way. So I don't know if there are others from Metro Transit wanted to comment on that.
I was just going to add that we're going to be watching the trends over the next 9 to 12 months before we do anything drastic. And I mentioned that we still have 40 routes suspended. We haven't made any hard decisions about them because we really want to see what happens, particularly this fall and into next spring, to help us determine what our next steps forward are after that.
Madam Chair, this is Wes. I would just add that we are the next part of this presentation at the next Transportation Committee meeting will be about some of the things that we're going to be doing as we emerge from, and I think that will in part answer Councilmember Fredson's questions. In terms of safety, we're certainly putting a lot of focus on safety. We need to put a lot of focus on safety with what's going on right now. We'll be talking a lot more about that later. We're looking at marketing that we would introduce in September. You'll be hearing more about that. We're looking at service at this as an opportunity to look at how we might redesign services as we go forward, and certainly have opportunities to test some things to see how they work. Perhaps that includes perhaps providing not providing services to every express park and ride, but consolidating services to certain park and rides and then improving the service once you get there. It's those sorts of ideas that we're looking at and we'll be talking more about in part 2 of this presentation.
Councilmember Fredson.
One quick follow-up on that. Thank you, Chair. So the legislature, of course, required or in partnership, we're moving forward with the study of both express routes and North Star, and I can't remember if there was a timeline associated with that. Do we know that off the top of our heads or not?
Chair Barber and Councilmember Fredson, I think I have it in my head, but I don't want to say a guess out loud in public. So I'll get that to you. That'd be a safer bet.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How competitive and how are we competitive at Metro Transit with when the school districts start hiring for the next school session that will be starting up as well? And do we see much leaving? We're the hiring bonus is great, the employee referral bonus is great, all of the things that we're doing are terrific. For hiring full-time, do we see people then shift, move? Do we compete? How do we compete? How do we compare with pay, benefits, things like that?
Mayor, Councilmember Cummings, are you able to hear me any better now? I understand out a little bit before.
You're still cutting a little bit.
Okay. Well, I'll try that as best I can, which is that we're in a continuous mode evaluating where we stand within the marketplace, ways that we're able to differentiate ourselves. Right now, our driving need is for the full-time match the service curve that we have, as Eric talked about, those high peaks during rush hour are at least temporarily suppressed. We're trying to hire for those full-time jobs, which comes with access to benefits in addition to our pay. The thing that we really need to sell is that our pay scale might be sort of right, at the same as organizations. That includes 5% step every year until top scale, and top scale is still head, our competitors.
Madam Chair, maybe just to add or fill in the blanks of the breakup a little bit, we're really dealing a little bit. I think Mr. Funk's saying we're dealing a little bit with a different market right now than the schools because we're looking for full-time staff, and we have an excellent benefit package, and we have excellent wages and progression of wages as we go through. So, in the past, we've actually been hiring more for our hires have been more to start as part-time and then go to full-time, which we always felt was a little bit of a disadvantage. Now we're hiring for full-time positions because we don't have enough operators that are part-time that want to move to full-time. So, I think we're just going to try to keep getting out there with these events and keep doing these on a regular basis and try to hire as many operators as possible. We've talked about overhiring on operators, and by that I mean when you're understaffed, you can afford to be a little overstaffed in moments and still keep within your budget. And we're trying to be smart about that and anticipate the ebbs and flows of the workplace market and try to better position ourselves, because the bottom line when it comes to operators is that people want service reliability. And so we're not going to promise services unless we think we can deliver them. I think that's better than trying to overpromise and then underperform. So that's the approach that we're taking to this, and we're trying to be aggressive in the hiring.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there additional questions or comments? Councilmember Chambliss.
I just want to express my appreciation for giving us a very detailed update on how the service has changed and how it's going to be monitored going forward. I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen after the fall with transportation. And I'm really happy about the fact that we have these opportunities for full-time jobs as bus drivers. I'll be sending out some information about that personally as well.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Reva. You captured my thoughts perfectly. Really, thank you to Eric, Adam, and Brian. We really appreciate you guys coming back to the committee. I think it's so important how we ramp service back up and how we emerge on the other side of this pandemic. And so all of the information you're providing us is very much appreciated. So I'll give out a final call. Is there any other questions, comments? All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good night. All right, now we are on to our next information item, which is the regional solicitation unique projects development process update. We have Cole Hineker here.
Good afternoon, council members. Thank you for having me today. Giving an update on something that we presented a few months ago, but prior to the time in which a work group of TAB started meeting to talk about unique projects, of which Councilmember Fredson and Barber were members of. So we're giving an update today on what the majority of the conclusions of that work group were, and we'll be presenting this to TAB in about 2 weeks. And so Councilmember Barber could bring any feedback that you may all have from today's presentation on the recommendations. So I'll also let them chime in if they want on any of how the committee went. But next slide, please. So a little bit of a reminder here on what the regional solicitation is. It's our process to distribute flexible federal funds to local projects that support our region's goals for transportation. And so it's about 200 million every 2 years. It's not a small amount of money. And it's generally looking at projects 4 to 5 years out. So it's not trying to pick or solve solutions of the problems that are tomorrow or even next year. It's really looking out 4 to 5 years and trying to get ahead of the needs of the transportation system. And TAB has always been very appreciative of how technical this process is. It tries to utilize a lot of metrics and a lot of data and input from technical staff from around the region. And so the unique projects is a little bit of a step away from that, and I'll cover that today. And then federal awards generally pay 80% of the project cost. And we have a lot of maximum project awards of about, anywhere from 3.5 to 10 million for the different categories. So it's a pretty significant amount of money for a project to achieve getting awarded an application. Next slide. And, we do always try to link the regional solicitation back to our Thrive outcomes and our TPP goals. I think you'll see today that a substantial amount of the recommendations tie back to things that are very front and center for the council today. And then, we always look at geographic balance as a secondary lens. TAB is very interested in making sure the whole region feels like they're part of the solicitation. And I think they took that lens also down to the unique projects category, and you'll see how that got reflected in the scoring. Next slide. So a really brief reminder, we did cover this the last presentation, but unique projects have historically been sort of an as needed case by case basis. There was a brief application category a few years ago. It didn't elicit the kind of project suggestions that I think TAB was really looking for. So they abandoned the idea of a unique projects category. But in 2018, we got a very interesting application that really didn't know where to apply. They actually applied, and this is St. Paul and Our Car, a project that was really collaborative along with XL Energy to install charging stations and provide shared mobility or shared use cars around St. Paul and in Minneapolis as well. They didn't really know where to apply, and so it kind of raised this issue to TAB of, if we have this project that we think is really good, how can we better accommodate it within our solicitation, recognizing that they have somewhat rigid categories for where projects can apply. And so they had some recommendations as part of a work group that met in 2019 to create a unique projects category and set aside a certain portion in the 2020 solicitation, which you all adopted the projects for earlier this year. And moving into what essentially would be, we're going to solicit for these projects in 2022, but we're going to set aside the money last cycle. And so they wanted to then use the interim year to establish how these projects would be evaluated and set the framework for applicants. And so that's what this work group was working on over the last few months. I think you can go 2 slides ahead. Maybe a break slide here. Oh, never mind. Sorry. Back 1 slide, please. Just a note that, as you can see here, these are all the different categories that the regional solicitation has. Under the 3 modal categories, there's a variety of different application types that you can submit, including the arterial bus rapid transit project that was created in 2020. But the unique projects is taken off the top. It is one of the sources that we use to fund the travel behavior inventory in our modeling program. But there's about 4 to 5 million that's going to be available for this category when we solicit next year. And so that's what we're really talking about, is how do we select projects for that 4 to 5 million within this category, and really how do they relate to all the other categories that are eligible for projects to apply under. So next slide. So we had a group that met. We met 5 times between April 23rd and just last Friday, July 9th was our final meeting. It's mostly comprised of TAB members with Barber and Fredson as our alternate serving on the committee. We had 4 county representatives, county commissioners. We had 3 city representatives, and then 5 council appointed citizen and modal representatives. And so their task was really to provide some high level policy direction so that technical staff can develop more details for this category, create an actual application, which if you've ever seen them, in some cases they're 15 pages long. So we do need to do a lot more work after this policy group wraps up, but we have a good framework to move forward with, and that's really what we wanted this policy work group to do. They met for about an hour and a half every Friday morning, so kudos to all of them, or every other Friday morning. It's a big ask, and I think it was really productive time that we spent with that group. Next slide. So on to what they recommended. We can go on to the next slide. A couple of things we wanted to cover up front. There was some questions about what does eligibility for unique projects mean, and I think there was some understanding from TAB that it meant that you couldn't apply in the other categories, and it really creates a difficult issue for staff to have to make the call on whether a project would be eligible in another category or not. It could be that a project is a mobility hub at a transit station, and in the past we'd funded those under the transit category. But in reality, they kind of serve more as unique projects. They bring together a lot of different modes and a lot of different access points. So that's just one example of a difficult project to determine eligibility on. So we're actually recommending that any type of project could apply under unique projects, but that the evaluation criteria really should determine whether you fit the goal and the purpose of the unique projects or not. And you'll see what that means as we get into the details. But we do have a purpose statement here that we want unique projects to be projects that fund, or sorry, a program that funds innovative projects that would not be eligible or competitive in other application categories, and that reduce environmental impacts, improve racial equity, and support multimodal communities. Those last 3 points are really the big goals of the program. And because they're not as strongly emphasized in some of the other application categories, that really should be the determinant for an applicant as to whether they want to apply as a unique project or as, say, a transit or a bike project, as well as whether they just don't really fit into those other categories as a project type. And so we also have a 2-step application process. So we think an early step of applicants wanted to check in and ask staff to make somewhat of a qualitative judgment call on whether they'd fit better in one application category or not. We can provide that feedback prior to them going through the rigorous application process. Next slide. So in terms of the timeline for unique projects, it's going to be a little bit unique because we are proposing a 2-step application process. This is not something that the regional solicitation has ever really done. So the first step is that we'll be putting out the regional solicitation for public comment later this year in September. And that public comment period will be open through about mid-November. But overlapping with that public comment period is we're going to ask potential applicants to submit a project interest form, in which they provide some high-level information on their application, and we'll give them feedback on it. That just allows us to meet timelines that we can consult with applicants for a few months to give them feedback on their project, perhaps answer any questions about eligibility, and then release the actual solicitation in February of 2022. And then applicants would be basically along the same timelines as the normal regional solicitation. And then they would be evaluated in the summer of next year, and then projects would be selected later that year. And again, for unique projects, we're really looking at projects that are 2 to 3 years out, so 2024 to 2025 timeframe for implementation. Next slide. So in the first step of the application, we're thinking, something along the lines of a page or 2 application submittal where the applicants provide a basic description of what they're proposing, a list of their project elements and a budget, and then a description of where the project would be or what populations are impacted by the project. And then a brief answer to each of the six questions that are criteria. Not meant to be an elaborate answer at this point, but just to give us a sense for how they're thinking this project would meet the goals of the unique projects category. And I'll go over those 6 on a subsequent slide. Staff would really be the primary audience for this first step to review the project for eligibility and provide technical feedback to the potential applicants. And this is really an optional step for applicants to get some feedback and maybe answer some questions about their project that they wouldn't want to put out there after going through the whole application process. We potentially would share this information with the policy work group that met over the last few months as a subset of TAB. But we do have to kind of respect confidentiality in this first stage and not wanting to give any applicant a leg up by being able to see the other potential applicants. So we're still kind of working through that detail, but it's a good first step for applicants to get some insights on where they could either make a determination on where they should apply, but also get some feedback on ways they might be able to improve their project and make it more competitive. Next slide. The second evaluation process, and this is during the formal evaluation of all regional solicitation projects next summer, would be very typical to our other application categories to have a very detailed description of project, including their need and how they plan to approach the implementation, a more line-item budget with the matches sources confirmed. So they have to have letters of support from any potential match partner. Detailed description of the project location and affected populations, and then much more elaborate responses to the evaluation questions that we're looking for, including any data that they can provide to support the claims that they're making in their application. So a kind of qualitative and quantitative combined response to our questions. This is very unique. The regional solicitation policy work group members are actually going to be the evaluators of these applications. We heard a lot from the policy work group members that while they can give us general guidance on some of these evaluation criteria, it might be a sort of you know it when you see it level of evaluation. And so we want to give them the ability to weigh in on, is this a project that is innovative? Is it a project that is addressing environmental concerns in a way that you guys had in your mind? And it gives them the flexibility to set out a framework for their evaluation, but really to apply it once they see the types of projects that they get. The technical staff would still serve a really important role of reviewing it for errors or providing some high-level input, but really allowing the policy work group members to have a more active role in project evaluation. The way it works in the normal solicitation is the technical staff all evaluate projects and we submit a ranked project list to TAB to use in their project selection process. So this is putting TAB at the forefront of the scoring process. So very unique, but we think it's going to be a really important and helpful step for this program. Next slide. So in terms of the criteria that the work group is recommending, we're using 6 primary criteria to evaluate projects, and they're posed as questions here. How does the project reduce adverse environmental impacts of transportation? Really looking at things like air quality, water quality, I mean, even things like noise and light pollution. And so that'll be something that the applicant will have to talk about how their project would do that. And this is based on our meeting on Friday, this is the second rated criteria that TAB emphasizes. So it's really one of the focal points of their unique projects asked this round. The second criteria here is how does the project improve racial equity? And so a lot of discussion amongst the work group about connectivity, access, barriers, making sure that segments of the population that have had barriers to access, that we're addressing those in this project. And even things like engagement, how our different population groups engage through this effort. And I think we even go down to the level of what is the makeup or what is the ownership structure of your partners that you're bringing to the table. So a pretty broad ranging focus on equity and a much more highly emphasized focus than in the other application categories. The third one here is how does the project support multimodal communities? So really looking at both how does it support bikeable, walkable, and transit-friendly communities, and including can it support multiple of those modes in its project? So is it truly multimodal in that it brings modes together and allows people to connect between them? but also how does it use land use strategies to advance the multimodal communities? So things like parking strategies or designing for density that is context specific or context sensitive. I think we're also considering first last mile solutions within this category, which is an area of need that always comes up from partners and always comes up at TAB. So they really wanted to emphasize that here. And then the fourth one here, and it's actually the highest rated criteria from a weighting perspective, is that TAB really does want a project that's innovative. And this really, it's hard to define, but I think that the way we're defining it is just something that's a new idea to the region or that solves a problem that's been long-standing in the region with a new approach. So this is probably the category that has the most, you know it when you see it, lens that's going to be applied to it, but it is the one that TAB really said was the most important for them to move forward with as a top ranking criteria. They do want this to be innovative category. Uh, the fifth one is, how does the project have regional impact, or could it be expanded to more of the region? So this is that regional balance, geographic balance question. A project is going to get more points if it can affect more people or more parts of the region. And it could also get points if it's just a pilot in one location, but it has the ability to expand and be applied to more of the region over time if the pilot proves successful. So that's an important factor. And then the last one there is, how does the project build partnerships or collaboration? And so the idea here is both, are they bringing a lot of different partners, diverse partners to the table to help deliver this project, to build those relationships? And then also, are they bringing in a lot of different matching sources, or are they having a high percentage of match to bring more dollars to the table where you kind of spread the risk amongst multiple partners? So those are what, and again, the work group just really had a conversation about this on Friday. We're bringing the details of this to TAB in a couple of weeks. The metrics are a lot more detailed. I kind of described them in qualitative terms today, but we'll certainly be developing more detail on those metrics moving forward for the application. Next slide. A couple of other rules just to wrap up the recommendations here. As I said, there is about 4 to 5 million available, and the work group decided that there really shouldn't be a limit. So that means that one application, if it were good enough, could receive all of the money in this category. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to be the case, but they did not set a project limit for this first round. But they did say that if we're going to get a lot of small applications, they would like them to be 500,000 or more, just to ensure that we're being cost-effective stewards of the federal dollars. It can be a lot of administrative work to handle 8 applications of 500,000. So to do more than that would be a lot of work for a number of different projects. And then, as I said, match requirements are going to be considered as part of scoring, but otherwise projects would only be expected to meet the minimum 20%. And there was some conversation about whether we should combine this with TDM funding pot that is in the regional solicitation, and they just recommended that we keep them separate for now, given that the council is embarking on a TDM regional study, and that we should wait for the recommendations of that study to be complete before doing anything with that pot of money. Next slide. So in terms of the next steps, we are going to be actually presenting this for the first time as recommendations to TAB, as I said, on July 21st. And then we'll proceed to also go to the technical committees to get their input, particularly from the technical perspective in July and August. And we'll then be finalizing the application materials based on any feedback that we receive at those meetings in the August to early September timeframe. And then we'll release the application materials for public comment in September, along with that, as I said, that initial call for project interest from applicants. So if this in particular interest to you all, if you know of a potential applicant or a project that you think might be interested in this type of funding, certainly start putting it on their radar, and you can put them in contact with council staff if they want to ask any more questions right now. But that's the next step. I think the last slide is maybe just my contact info. Yep. So it's been a great pleasure to work with this work group, and I'm sure Councilmember Barber and Fredson can say that I think it was a really productive time spent, but would welcome any other questions that council members have this time.
Thank you, Cole. Councilmember Chambliss.
Thanks for that presentation. Regional solicitation funds and opportunities are always exciting to see what people come up with. My question is related to the evaluation criteria on page 12. And adding the building partnerships or collaborations, I think that is a really important criteria. And the collaboration, I think, in partnership should also have, in all of these criteria, actually, do we have some points of evaluation so that we can determine and strengthen accountability? I'm not sure if that would mean, periodic reviews of people who have received the funding, or even staging the distribution of dollars based on meeting the criteria. So if you could address that. And secondly, I'd like to talk about the groups stressing the project innovative criteria. I know that's come up with the LCA criteria, and one of the things that I think needs to really be looked at with innovative, I think we should also kind of list, and you stated it, that not just being innovative, but enhancing existing best practices, I think is really important. If the focus is always on, who is creating the most new, that's not the right grammar, but you know what I mean, or the most innovative projects, it may not provide incentives for projects that are utilizing best practices. And best practices shows continuous improvement. It's really hard to have continuous improvement if every cycle we're doing new and innovative things. What are we building off of? So if they could have points for both, that would be great. And I know Deb and Fredson can maybe chime in on this since they were part of that discussion.
If I can add just a little of context, I think that's why, we have the overall regional solicitation, which we really are focused on best projects, best practices, but we wanted to have the ability to be able to innovate, to be leaders and ahead of other regions and coming up with new ideas and ways to do things. And so that's why this sort of smaller set of funding was set aside. And, really, we want to be innovative, but we also want to accomplish the group really talked a lot about the key goals that we wanted to have projects that both would be directed at reducing adverse environmental impacts and improving racial equity. And so this is the reason why this money was allocated under the last solicitation and being awarded later, because you can't have innovation on a project that is 5 years out. You're not going to be innovative. And so, yes, I still agree that one of the things we also talked about was being able to scale it and apply it in other places, which is across the region, even if it was a targeted project. And that does require best practices. And that is certainly something that we talked about. So I'd say it's a little bit of both to be able to be successful in this category. But I think some of the discussions as we go through and actually do some of the scoring, some of this will kind of work itself out as we look at what actually comes into us. But definitely agree. We wanted something that, yes, is innovative, but can be replicated and can or could be scalable. So, and that would require using best practices. So. Paul, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, when I do think that, within the category of best practices, there's certainly opportunity to bring best practices to this region for the first time. And that's, I think, a lot of what TAB has in mind is, an area that's already developed somewhere else, but maybe bringing it to this region. In terms of your question about the partnerships, one of the things that we do want to emphasize in the project is the ability to evaluate, to self-evaluate your program. And so we haven't written the criteria yet, but I think we would emphasize that across all of the different categories. You know, how do you propose to evaluate your impact on the environment? How do you propose to evaluate equity as part of your project? So really leaving it up to the applicants to propose that and using that as part of our scoring guidance. But, and this is actually a nice segue into the next conversation that we'll have, that we always do a before and after study of the solicitation to see about what types of impacts do our projects have after they're implemented. And so we haven't talked about how do you know, integrate unique projects yet, because they're still a few years out, but we'll certainly have that conversation in a couple of years.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Perfect. Any other questions or comments from council members? All right. Thanks, Cole. Appreciate it. We do have one more information item. I know we're pushing up towards 6, but this should only take about 15 minutes, and it ties in really well to what Cole was just talking about of the before and after study of the regional solicitation. As long as everyone's in agreement, we with moving ahead with that, we could do that. If objections, raise your hand now.
I just have a Met Council related event to go to at 7, so I may have to sneak out a little
Okay.
early.
All right, like I said, it should take about 15 minutes. So, but then if you do have questions, by all means, please reach out to Dave and he will get back in touch with you. All right, so we have the next one is the regional solicitation before and after study, and we have Dave Burns here.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I'll try to make this as quick as possible. Make sure you guys get out here and get some dinner. Today, I'll be providing an overview of the major findings of the regional solicitation before and after study part 2. So as a bit of background, this study kicked off in the spring of 2020, and we completed the final document last month. So overall, the study will assist the council and our stakeholders in determining if the criteria used in the regional solicitation are successful in garnering the desired outcomes and to help inform potential changes to future solicitations. So phase 1 of this project was completed in 2019. And one of the key recommendations as part of this study, of phase 1 of the study, was to develop a project database. So this database, which was actually a key task within this phase 2 of the study, helps us to better understand whether our criteria may need to be tweaked in future solicitations. Another recommendation from phase 1 of the study was to conduct a comprehensive peer review of other MPOs in the country and document their processes for distributing funds within their region and kind of see what we can learn from that and glean from it. This was also fulfilled in phase 2 of this study, and the results are codified in the final report. So the work from phase 1 of the study really prompted greater interest in how the regional solicitation application process could be improved and streamlined. So that's really where the idea of doing a phase 2 of this study stems from. Oh, next slide, please. So the project team consisted of Lance Bernard from HKGI, Ashley Hudson from Bolton Menk was the main sub on the contract, and I was the project manager for the council. Next slide, please. Okay, the main objectives of this phase 2 of the study were to sort of refine the approach for monitoring the after conditions of projects that have been funded by the regional solicitation. Again, the purpose of this was to evaluate whether we are meeting our desired outcomes as a region. So this was done by measuring the benefits of funded projects by comparing the before conditions with the after conditions. It also includes recommendations for tools and data sets that we could use to continue to monitor the conditions of completed projects. Another key objective of the study was to research ways to streamline and improve the application process. So in order to do this, we leveraged focus groups consisting of both consultants with a lot of experience preparing these applications and discussed some of the positive and negative feedbacks of their experience with the application process. A specific task that I want to point out is it included examining the existing multi-use trail usage criteria and vis-a-vis the criteria used by other MPOs for prioritizing bike and ped project applications. Some of the other things that we looked at in the study is we were interested in examining the fate of projects which actually did not receive regional solicitation funding. We wanted to know specifically, were they resubmitted during a later or a future solicitation? Did they move forward without regional solicitation funding? So basically, to answer the overall question, to what extent does the successful procurement of these regional solicitation funds impact whether a project will be constructed? Next, we wanted to understand some of the factors that can cause a project from being built on time or altogether. Are revisions needed specifically to the risk assessment criteria in order to prevent projects from being withdrawn or delayed in the future? And we also wanted to simplify the process and develop a list and how-to guide of crash modification factors in order to allow applicants to easily select and apply the crash modification factor that best fits the application. Next slide, please. So some of the overall findings is combined. We looked at the 2014, 2016, 2018, and 2020 cycles. We garnered over 538 grant applications, which totaled $1.87 billion in requested funds. And the regional solicitation provided nearly half of the requested funds, totaling 782 million over the 4 cycles, which I just mentioned. Next slide, please. Okay, as I just noted, the first task of the study was to gather data and populate this regional solicitation project database. Most of the after data came from projects from the 2014 regional solicitation, which were primarily constructed between 2017 and 2019. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as you might expect, obtaining reliable after conditions proved problematic. Data from 2020 and 2021, because of COVID-19, were unlikely to accurately portray the effects of the project's construction due to the significant decline in traffic volumes and transit ridership during the period. Because of these data constraints, we placed more emphasis on kind of putting the methodology in place to measure the before and after conditions in the future. So this project really helped us to create the framework for measuring before and after conditions moving forward. Next slide, please. One thing we consistently heard from our applicants was that our current congestion measure is a little bit difficult for applicants to determine and requires the use of a software called Synchro. So Synchro is fairly cost prohibitive and often requires professional consulting firms to perform an analysis just for the solicitation application, which can be quite costly. In order to examine sort of an alternative to the use of Synchro for this kind of congestion measure, the project team did an analysis of congestion using data available from the Streetlight Insight platform. As you can see from the results of this table, which has a summary, which includes a summary of projects from the 2014 solicitation. Streetlight data was able to gather, good quality information on the before and after results of the projects. This really kind of helped confirm that the use of this data set, which is easier to process and currently available from the council, could be a viable alternative to the synchro analysis. So our overall recommendation was that we should perhaps consider using a big data source such as Streetlight or perhaps another vendor for the before and after congestion conditions. And this also better aligns with our congestion management process. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of safety, actually in this project, we developed a customized GIS tool which we created to automate monitoring and reporting the safety results. So ultimately, this is going to help us determine whether the completed project shows that we have that they are having the intended positive effect on safety. So it's kind of a screenshot of this tool that was developed as part of the study. The tool depicts the data through a GIS dashboard for built roadway projects that have received federal transportation funds, and it includes information on total crashes, fatal crashes, serious injury crashes, fatal and serious injury crash rate, bicycle and pedestrian crashes, and then also a crash cost aspect of the tool and the overall crash rate. Again, we don't have a lot of completed projects to show off on this, but it's very important in determining whether the safety criteria may need to be altered in the future. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I mentioned, just a limited number of projects that have sufficient after data to see the true effects. This is a small sample size. In general, we are seeing that they are improving the safety overall. Next slide, please. So digging more into the projects not awarded regional solicitation funds, got some numbers here. 42% of the funding requests fulfilled over the past 4 cycles, which amounted to 782 million. So that leaves 313 projects that remain unfunded. So some projects move forward without regional solicitation funds, but often projects are being scaled back, or fewer amenities, enhancements, including like sidewalks and other pedestrian and bicycle facilities, or delayed until funding is secured. So applications that did not receive funding for a given solicitation but resubmitted at a future solicitation had kind of varying success in their resubmittal efforts, with approximately 29% eventually receiving funding. It might not even be fair to call that varying success. That's a fairly low success rate for applicants who are denied and apply in the future. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of non-motorized summary, we also examined the non-motorized application categories. Just a couple of notes here. A total of 74.4 miles of RBTN bikeway miles have been built or programmed using regional solicitation funds. Overall, the most significant takeaway was that the region could consider changing the bicycle and pedestrian measures by incorporating sort of a scoring criterion that considers the project's design and its ability to improve one's comfort level and safety. The focus group overall considered this a stronger measure in evaluating a project's potential for generating bike ped usage, and it's used by MPOs such as Dallas and St. Louis, among others. Next slide, please. We also examined whether the risk assessment measures were beneficial. Since 2014, 25 projects have been delayed or not built. Again, that's out of 280 something, which I can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize. 14 were program year extensions, 11 were withdrawals. Please do note this includes HSIP funded projects, so that constituted a high percent of those 25 projects. Program year extensions are requested. Our findings suggest that the program year extensions are requested to better align awarded projects with other projects that are being built near the project area. So 50% of the program year extensions were requested to help align a project's delivery or the construction schedule with other program projects in the area. So kind of the conclusion is that there's no evidence suggesting a common theme to the type of projects that request withdrawals. The only commonality of note is the HSIP withdrawals, which are all tied to design and scope changes. So no need to eliminate the risk assessment criteria or measures. They've shown to be beneficial. All right, next slide, please. Getting into the key takeaways. Overall, the project team felt that we could do a little bit better job on providing greater clarity on the goals of the regional solicitation program. What are we trying to fund? What are we trying to do? What are our priorities? There's some concern, some acknowledgement perhaps by our stakeholders that funding is being spread across too many funding categories, which may make it a little bit unclear as to what we're trying to accomplish again. It's also a little unclear, based on our feedback, how some of these measures directly relate to the funding application categories. So many felt that there is a need for, on the council's behalf, to provide greater transparency on how projects are scored and selected and how the criteria is chosen as well. Taking all that feedback, which is very valuable feedback, we're going to continue to reevaluate this process to ensure funds are going towards projects with the greatest regional benefit and the going towards projects that meet our goals and desires as a region. So that is it for me. The next is just a thank you slide, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, any questions or comments from council members? All right, they're quiet at the end of the meeting. So, but no, thank you for doing this, and I'm glad that we continually go and look back, and I think that's really important because we want to make sure that, yeah, the investments are getting directed in the right places and really sort of reflect the values of TAB and the council. So thank you for the update. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So with that, I'm going to take. Yep, thanks, Dave. Have a good night. One thing, just for the committee, you'll notice that Jenna Ernst is not on the call tonight. So just as a reminder, MTS hosts the first 6 months of the year, and so our recording secretary comes from MTS. For the second half of the year, it comes through Metro Transit. So first, a thank you to Jenna for supporting the committee for the first half of the year, and welcome back to Becky Gorell. And I also want to just mention that yesterday was Becky's 5-year anniversary at Metro Transit. So congratulations, and keep up the good work. We're certainly happy to have you on board with us. So thanks, Becky. All right, anything from council members before we go? All right, seeing and hearing nothing else, we can be adjourned for the evening. Thank you all.